Hello there, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel, Analyze This Mr. Bond, where I discuss the James Bond cultural phenomenon, and I'm here to say today that I was wrong. I was wrong about James Bond's standard martini order. Try to say that 5 times fast. If you've watched my recent video on the Vesper martini, which is not Bond's standard martini order, but is still a Bond-authored martini recipe, it's the martini he creates in the adventure Casino Royale, both in the original Ian Fleming novel and the 2006 film adaptation, I mostly stand by what I have to say in that video. But some of the things I said there were guided by misconceptions, and in general there are just a lot of myths floating around James Bond's martini, why he orders it shaken, not stirred. And I thought I would take this video as an opportunity to not just clear up my own mistakes, but clear up some of the misconceptions around James Bond's love of martinis. What started me down this path is that I finally had the opportunity to procure a rare aperitif. Tempus Fugit is a company that makes recreations of vintage spirit formulas. And they have a vintage Kina recreation called Kina L'Aéro. Kina may mean something to you. If you're familiar with the Vesper cocktail recipe, Ian Fleming prescribes the use of Kina Lillet instead of vermouth in the Vesper martini. Kina Lillet is a vintage aperitif that really has no direct equal today. Lillet Blanc is its direct successor, but Lillet Blanc today doesn't resemble what Kina Lillet was when Ian Fleming was creating the Vesper cocktail. It's a fairly different profile today. There are other alternatives that are often suggested for use in a Vesper cocktail, like Coca Americano, and Coca Americano is something that I love very much, but it doesn't have the same bite that you would have gotten from Kina Lillet in Ian Fleming's time. So when I was able to procure a bottle of Tempus Fugit Kina L'Aéro, I was really excited about it because it's widely agreed to be the best modern substitute for Ian Fleming's Kina Lillet. And I've tried it and it's wonderful, and it makes more sense of the Vesper martini structure than any other aperitif I've tried. However, that's not the only thing that was different about these materials in Ian Fleming's day. The gin he would have known and the vodka he would have known were higher proof. Ian Fleming would have known an 100 proof vodka, not the lower proof vodkas that are widely available today, and also an 100 proof gin. So the Vesper cocktail, as Ian Fleming originally prescribed it, had an ABV that was off the charts. And I really wanted to try that vintage Vesper formula to wrap my head around how these spirits would have worked together, how Ian Fleming would have understood the Vesper cocktail. And it is one heck of a punchy drink. But trying a vintage Vesper made with 100 proof vodka, high proof gin, I did Tanqueray London Dry, which is about 94 proof, and the wonderful Tempus Fugit Kina L'Aéro, it unlocked something for me. It unlocked the Vesper cocktail, which is still brutal and somewhat harsh, but made sense, especially when made with the shaken method. Mixologists often debate whether you should shake or stir a martini. It is widely agreed that stirring is the superior method, because what you do when you shake a martini is that you essentially dilute it. A lot of water is added into the cocktail as you shake it over ice. The ice breaks apart and the water infuses the cocktail. And with modern proof spirits, which are like 80 proof, say, it does water the cocktail down far too much. Shaking a cocktail today doesn't make a lot of sense. The spirits are already more rounded and smooth in a way that doesn't need that aeration. But when you try 100 proof vodka and nearly 100 proof gin together, the dilution actually opens the cocktail up. Because those spirits have such a high ABV, when you try to consume them, what you get is a lot of that burn. The added water from shaking it actually allows those spirits to open up. And in fact, the vodka Ian Fleming would have known was likely significantly less well filtered than the vodka we have now. The 100 proof Smirnoff that I used in my Vesper is actually probably a lot smoother than what Fleming would have known. So Fleming was dealing with some pretty volatile materials, diluting it. And that makes sense of what we're told about Ian Fleming via his biographer, Andrew Lysette, who said that Fleming believed shaking a cocktail made it more flavorful. That's not necessarily true today, but in my experience, it is true if you are using high-proof spirits. That dilution allows you to peer past the kind of rough, abrasive aspects of high ABV and experience the actual character of the spirit. So my hypothesis is that the reason Bond shakes his martini instead of stirring it is because of the nature of these vintage spirits. Now, the truth is nobody really knows where the shaken, not stirred methodology came from. We know that shaking cocktails was a popular method in the 19th and early 20th century. One of the notable cocktail books, Harry Craddock's Savoy Cocktail Book from 1930, suggested shaking as the methodology for all of its martinis. So shaking a martini was kind of in the ether around Ian Fleming as a popular method at that time. We're told by Andrew Lysette that Fleming enjoyed what it did to the flavor, but there are other myths that continue to persist that I'm always debunking on Instagram, and I'm going to debunk them again here. One of them is that Bond shakes his martini instead of stirring it because he wants that extra dilution because it's going to keep him from getting drunk as fast. That's actually not true at all. There's no evidence that that was ever an impetus for why Bond shakes his martini. There's no documentation to that effect. And people have actually shaken a cocktail and stirred a cocktail and compared the effects, and alcohol is absorbed at practically the same rate. You are not going to get less inebriated if you shake your vodka martini than if you stir it. There is also a little bit of a misconception about what spirits Bond prefers in a martini. In the novels, Bond is not directly partial to vodka. Ian Fleming himself preferred a gin martini, and Bond drinks vodka and gin martinis in about equal measure in the novels, and actually tends to prefer whiskey more than he does vodka or gin in the novels. He's much more of a brown liquor drinker. But in the films, we can definitely agree that the vodka martini has become Bond's singular drink, and he's always asking for it shaken, except for the few occasions where either he says he doesn't care, or in the 1967 film You Only Live Twice, he's polite and nods along when a guest mistakenly stirs it for him instead of shakes it. Another misconception I see pop up as to why Bond shakes versus stirs his cocktails, because vodka could sometimes be dodgy in those days. And that's certainly something that comes up in the Ian Fleming novels. There's a bit in the novel Moonraker, I believe, where Bond sprinkles some pepper on his vodka to pull out the toxins, a habit he developed after being taught by a Russian that that's how you get rid of the toxins in cheap vodka. And vodka at that time might have been a little rough and tumble, so Bond has his martini shaken to make sure that those toxins essentially get shaken out of the vodka. That's chemically not how things work, and that's also nothing we have any evidence for. As noted, shaking was an accepted methodology for martini creation in the early 20th century. Ian Fleming would have been familiar with it, and as far as we know, Ian Fleming prescribed the shaken not stirred methodology just because he liked the way it tasted. And once again, my hypothesis is that he liked the way it tasted because he was dealing with a higher proof vodka and a higher proof gin. And if you aerated them with a little extra water that comes through shaking a cocktail, you could taste the flavor profile of that spirit a little bit better, rather than just being confronted by the harsh burn of a high ABV spirit. Today, you don't really need to do that. If you're using a standard top shelf gin or vodka today, that approach is not really necessary. So even if you're going to make yourself a nice Vesper today, you don't need to go that route. You don't need to shake your Vesper. You can still stir your Vesper. I think you'll be fine. But I do highly recommend that you seek out and try Tempus Fugit Kina L'Aéro d'Or, it works to unify the structure of a Vesper better than anything I've tried, and it also really works well in a standalone martini. You need less of it than you would need a standard vermouth in a martini, so if you like your martinis pretty dry, you might want to dial this back, but the flavor profile is also different than your standard vermouth. It has a lot more character, it has a lot more spice and bitterness. So it has a lot of presence that you need to balance against whatever spirit you're using. I would primarily pair the Tempus Fugit Kina L'Aéro d'Or with a gin. I wouldn't necessarily think that it works exceptionally well with a vodka. I think a vodka martini, you really want to keep that either as clean as possible. I don't really love a vodka martini, to be honest with you. But if you're going to have a vodka martini, you either want to keep that as clean as possible or make it as dirty as possible, because vodka is a neutral spirit. It'll work well with olive brine. But if you don't want your martini dirty, you really want to keep that vodka as clean and cool, as refreshing as possible, and just make it a vessel for the slight hint of what vermouth is doing there, alongside citrus, perhaps a lemon peel, to really accentuate the clean, smooth profile of ice-cold vodka. That's my big hypothesis and realization about James Bond's classic martini. I'm still annoyingly dogmatic about a martini. I believe that the gin martini is the proper way. I believe that you should have a proper amount of vermouth in that gin martini. I believe that the vodka martini is kind of a weird offshoot that isn't as satisfying, it's not as flavorful, it's not as interesting. It has its place, I think, if you're gonna have a dirty martini. I think it's easier to make a solid dirty martini with vodka than it is with gin. So I understand why it has its place, but it's generally the lesser option. And I think the Vesper cocktail itself is a kind of brutal drink. Even in its vintage form, as Ian Fleming prescribed it, I think it works better and has a little bit more logic behind its structure. I think that Kina L'Aéro d'Or is wonderful and works to unify the structure a bit more, but it's still a pretty harrowing drink, and you can understand why Ian Fleming later called that drink unpalatable. But I still think the structure is worth playing around with to find a variation that suits you. But where I'm going to be less dogmatic in the future is shaking versus stirring. If for some reason a cocktail is particularly high proof, which is rare these days, but if you are using a higher proof gin or vodka, maybe shaking is the order of the day. So thank you for watching, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one.